Donnie and Dolly. The team is supported by ableauctions.ca. Closing your business? We can help.
All of our guests today brought to you by our friends from Campbell River. We'll talk about them more during the Is It Just Me segment. Quinsam Communications Group. Delaney's OK Tire and Langley inbox just ahead of Dean Brown, voice of the Senators. How much McDonald's do you think Kyle Wellwood ate in comparison to Connor Bedard? I always say this about Kyle Wellwood. There's this famous or infamous picture of him
at a pool,
hanging around the pool. He's got a broken leg, and people talking about, look at his gut, look at it. Hey, I would kill to look like that.
Yeah.
I thought he looked, for the average guy, he looked fine.
Yeah.
I guess for a finely tuned NHL player, not so much. Maybe we could dig that up and we'll see what people think. I'm sure Dean Brown would be excited to see it. Dean Brown joins us, voice of the Ottawa Senators, TSN 1200. Senators play the Canucks tomorrow, Rogers Arena. Last night, a 5-4 victory down in Seattle, a town that, and you tweeted this out, that you're enamored with. You love Seattle. But what stood out last night, Dean, as we thank you for joining us?
Well, I suppose from an Ottawa perspective, I think what stood out is just they stuck to it. You know, I think it's easy, especially when you're a young team like Ottawa. You get up by 3, you're all excited, and you think this is going to be easy, and then all of a sudden you find yourself tied at 3. And it's easy to wilt away against a good 5-on-5 team like Seattle. But I think one of the things that they probably like about their game last night, not just the win, would be the fact that they stayed with it and found a way to come back and win a game that probably they didn't look like they were going to win in the last couple of minutes.
4 points out of a playoff spot. Dean, did you expect the Senators to be this successful this season?
To be honest with you, no, not after the crappy November they had. You know, they ran into so many injuries and to all the wrong people. You know, in this game, it's not so much how many injuries you have, it's who's injured. And, you know, this team started the year basically without its number one goaltender, its number one center, and for a while its number one defenseman. And as a team just coming out of a rebuild, they're really not deep enough to be able to, you know, live through those kinds of injuries. And their November showed it. They were terrible in November. And so I really didn't think it was a hole they could dig themselves out of. But here they are, one of the best winning percentages in the league, I think, since the middle of January or something like that. And they've really turned the corner that way. And, you know, for fans in Ottawa, it really makes you wonder where they'd be right now if they had even a halfway decent November. But right now, everybody in Ottawa is mesmerized with the idea that they could catch up and that they could possibly capture a playoff spot. So that's kind of the feeling in Ottawa right now.
He popped in a goal last night, and I love the shots of his grandfather chomping on the Tim Hortons the other night. But Jakob Chychrun for 3 draft picks. How did that deal go down in Ottawa? What was the response, and how has he played so far, Dean?
The response was overwhelming because I think most people thought it was never going to happen because it was on the front burner, off the front burner, off the stove, not even in the kitchen anymore, back in the kitchen, not near the stove, back on the stove, back burner though. And people didn't know it had moved to the front burner by the time it actually happened. Pierre Dorion told us that basically he thought everything was baked and finished, and then in 24 hours, all of a sudden, it was a deal. And I think probably the biggest thing was the price. You know, Chychrun had been on the market for over a year. He asked for a trade over a year ago, but Arizona's price was always too steep for Ottawa or, for that matter, any other team. You know, nobody was going to give up, you know, a first-round pick, 2 first-round picks, a starting player, and a prospect. That's the kind of payout usually that goes to a Norris Trophy winner or a Norris Trophy candidate defenseman. And Chychrun is very good, but I don't think he's ever received a vote yet for the Norris Trophy. So when the price came down and it happened, it was very big news because the general manager made it very clear in the summertime they were looking for a top 4 defenseman, and it looked like it just wasn't going to happen. So when it did, the fact that it was a top 4 defenseman, which they've been looking for, obviously, like a lot of teams, and it was a guy that has long Ottawa roots. His father grew up in Ottawa. His grandfather obviously is still there. His sister lives there. The family was overjoyed that it was Ottawa, that it was the place he was going, and it just kind of all fell into place. But people are very excited about the possibilities.
Dean, 5 years in a row, no playoffs. Okay, in your eyes, when is this going to turn? Like the playoffs, it's close right now, but can you sense it? Like, are you still thinking a year or two, or maybe even closer?
No, now. You know, they've moved out of the rebuild portion. Any real rebuild, you know, not a patchwork rebuild, but any real rebuild.
Right.
The first year of the rebuild isn't a rebuild; it's a teardown. You are getting rid of assets, and that's the painful part for everybody, for the fans, for the team, for everybody. That's the painful part. Because you have to move out really good players and lots of players that you really like. But if you're going to do it, the only successful way to rebuild is a teardown rebuild. So, you know, they probably were in a situation where they should have been challenging for a playoff spot last year. But last year they just had so many injuries to, again, all the wrong people. And they were one of the teams that was hit the hardest by COVID. They had 3 serious bouts where they had double-digit players out at the same time, you know. So this is probably where they should be right now. They should be a team right now coming out of the rebuild where they are challenging for a playoff spot or winning a playoff spot. And as I said before, to be honest with you, if they had any kind of a decent November, they would probably be in a pretty good playoff spot right now and not a wild card. So they're about where they expected to be. Maybe a little bit later because last year was kind of a delay year, but they're about where they thought they would be coming out of the rebuild.
Dean, the big story with this team is also off the ice, the sale of the team. Multiple bidders for the club. Can you give us an update on what you know about the sale of this hockey club?
Well, I can give you stuff that I've read from Bruce Garriock and the people who do know something. I pride myself on knowing very little about most things, which means I can't be wrong very often. So
you should be on this show.
I always say the dumber I get, the more useful I am to others. So it's going to be sold. It's going to be a group of people that are billionaires who are going to own it. All we know is that there's kind of a time frame that kind of has to be met because part of the ownership is going to be building a new building at Le Breton Flats in Ottawa, which is owned by the NCC, which is a division of the federal government.
Right.
And so that process really has to be signed off on by the middle of the summer. So the time frame is really now. They've got to get the bidders down, got to decide who it's going to be, who's going to own this team, go through the process of voting at the governors and awarding the team, and then they have to get on with the process of signing a deal with the NCC to start the new building moving. So I don't know who's going to end up winning this thing. We all know that there are more than 4 bidders that are kind of, as they narrow things down.
Okay.
Everybody in Ottawa knows that no matter who owns the team, they want Ryan Reynolds to be involved, and that's all I know.
Will it be a major disappointment in Ottawa? And I believe he's involved in the Remington Group. It will be a major disappointment if Ryan Reynolds isn't one of the owners?
I think it'll be a major disappointment for the league. And most people think, Donnie, that although nothing's ever been said, but most people think that if it's not the Remington Group, which he's kind of connected himself to, if one of the other groups ends up getting the team, they will make a pitch to him, and it's likely that he will be involved in some way, even if it's not the Remington Group. And it's really league driven. It's hard to imagine that whichever group gets this does not try their darndest to include him in ownership in some way, mostly because the league has made it very clear, I understand, to all the bidders that they would very heavily want whoever owns it to have him involved, just because it's so good for the entire league. It's not just about Ottawa. You know, when he tweets out something good about the NHL, it goes to 100 million people all around the globe. It's not like, you know, he's sending a tweet to Nanaimo or something. It's going global, you know what I mean? And so that's a huge thing for the league. And I think also the thought is that, you know, if he kind of shows the way, there's other major entertainment stars who might want to become involved in some way and maybe in ownership in the NHL. So all the possibilities for the league are so strong. The league has indicated, from what I understand, that whichever group gets this bid, it'll be strongly pushed upon them to make him involved in some way, shape, or form.
How long have you been at this team doing play-by-play?
612 years. Well, I mean, this is 30 years of hockey, and I did 10 years of CFL football before that. Although all 10 years weren't play-by-play. The first year I did like the sidelines and intermission, like that. And then the next year I did color, and then the third year I did play-by-play. So I've been doing play-by-play for 37 years or thereabouts.
Nice.
Well,
very old.
I've got
very
the
old, dinosaur-like.
Well, I can relate. I've got the NHL Network in my car, and I pick up Ottawa broadcasts. Well, you're a joy to listen to. Just absolutely tremendous, Dean, and have been for a long time. 30 years. All the best, my friend. And Senators and Canucks tomorrow. Thanks so much for doing this, Dean.
Anytime, boys.
You bet.